The origins of the play. A quarto is a form of printed book common in Elizabethan England. Each sheet of paper has been printed with 4 pages of text on one side and 4 on the other. The sheet is then folded twice to produce 4 leaves. Quarto means 4. The folded leaves then need to be trimmed to reveal 8 pages of a book. Why this history lesson? In the Elizabethan period, plays and poetry were often published in quartos. The first published edition of The Merchant of Venice is printed in what is known as the first quarto, 1600, which we'll be referring to throughout these videos. It's believed that Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice between 1596 and 1599. The title on the copy of the play printed in the first quarto of 1600 is The Most Excellent History of the Merchant of Venice. When the play was registered for copyright in 1598, it was recorded as The Merchant of Venice, or otherwise called The Jew of Venice. It's believed that Shakespeare based his play on Giovanni Fiorentino's 14th century novella Il Pecorone. Although there are some plot differences between the novella and Shakespeare's later play, the similarities are so obvious that we can't doubt the source of Shakespeare's inspiration. Il Pecorone, an impoverished young noble called Gianetto, needs to borrow money to woo a rich widow who lives in Belmont. The Merchant of Venice, an impoverished young noble called Bassanio, needs to borrow money to woo a rich young woman called Portia who lives in Belmont. Gianetto's friend in Il Pecorone, the merchant Ansaldo, agrees to help him, but he has a cash flow problem, and a Jew agrees to lend Gianetto 10,000 ducats on condition that if he does not repay the loan, the Jew can take a pound of flesh from any part of Ansaldo's body. Gianetto succeeds and marries the widow, but he forgets to pay Ansaldo back. When he learns that the deadline for repayment has passed and that Ansaldo is in trouble, Gianetto confesses all to his wife and rushes to Venice to help his friend. Gianetto's wife disguises herself as a lawyer from the University of Bologna and goes to the trial in Venice and successfully wins the case, arguing that the Jew has a right to his pound of flesh, but if he takes more or less than a pound or draws blood, his life is forfeit. The lawyer refuses payment and insists instead on the ring that Gianetto is wearing, and he is reluctant to give her the ring, but in the end agrees. Gianetto and Ansaldo go to Belmont, where Gianetto's wife has an argument with him about the missing ring. They make up and live happily ever after. Well, of course we see the similarities with the Merchant of Venice as we continue. Bassanio's friend, the merchant Antonio, agrees to help him, but he has a cash flow problem. Shylock the Jew agrees to lend Bassanio 10,000 ducats on condition that if he does not repay the loan, Shylock can take a pound of flesh from any part of Antonio's body. Bassanio succeeds and marries Portia, but the deadline for repaying Antonio passes before he can pay Antonio back, and Bassanio confesses all to Portia and rushes to Venice to help Antonio. Portia disguises herself as a doctor of law, goes to the trial in Venice and successfully wins the case, arguing that the Jew has a right to his pound of flesh, but if he takes more or less than a pound or draws blood, his life is forfeit. Portia refuses payment and insists instead on the ring that Bassanio is wearing. He is reluctant to give her the ring, but in the end agrees, and Bassanio and Portia quarrel about the ring and then make up. On the other hand, there are some key differences. In Il Pecorone, the unnamed lady is a beautiful but unscrupulous widow who has decreed that whoever docks their boat in her harbour must woo her. If they fail, they must give up everything they've brought with them, and no one has succeeded because the lady drugs and tricks them. She is rich because of their money. While of course in The Merchant of Venice, Portia is rich because of inherited family wealth. She's a victim of her father's will. Whoever chooses the correct casket will win her hand in marriage. In Il Pecorone, the merchant Ansaldo's cash flow problem is because Gianetto has tried twice to win the hand of the widow. Each time Ansaldo lent him an expensive ship that was claimed by the widow, and consequently Ansaldo is running low on cash and can't afford to lend Gianetto a third ship. In The Merchant of Venice, Antonio's cash flow problems are because his ships are out at sea. He's confident that they will return before the repayment of Shylock's loan is due. In the original text, there are no subplots, but in The Merchant of Venice, there are subplots with Jessica and Lorenzo, Nerissa and Gratiano, and there are also minor comic moments, e.g. with Launcelot Gobbo. In the original, the lady's maid gives Gianetto a hint, which enables him to marry the widow, and the lady's maid marries Ansaldo at the end of the play. In The Merchant of Venice, there is a clue for Bassanio in the song about which casket to choose. Nerissa, Portia's maid, marries a different character at the end of the play, and of course Antonio doesn't marry anyone. Now, we will explore reasons for the changes throughout this video series. In the meantime, where did the story of the three caskets come from? Well, this can be found in a collection of tales called Gesta Romanorum, Deeds of the Romans, and that's believed to have been published at the end of the 13th or beginning of the 14th century. Shakespeare's decision then to set the play in Venice and Belmont is clearly influenced by his source material, Il Pecorone. Let's examine the significance of these settings in closer detail. Venice. In Elizabethan England, Venice was an independent city-state and a key trading centre. Because Venice is surrounded by water, it was easy for ships to access, and naval trade that came through importing and exporting goods on ships, thrived. Situated between Western Europe and Eastern regions, people of many nationalities visited or lived there. Portia's suitors are also from all over the world: Morocco, Aragon, Naples, Germany, that's Palatine and Saxony, France, England and Scotland. This parallels the international community in Venice, which was a hub of commercial activity where exotic goods like spices, textiles, porcelain and valuable gems were traded. As we will see, very few Jewish people lived in England during the Elizabethan times because in 1290 King Edward I had expelled them. Venice, however, had a Jewish community. Jewish people were allowed to lend money and charge interest on a loan, and this was forbidden for Christians. Despite being allowed to do business in Venice, Jewish people were forced to live in a ghetto, an area where only Jews could live. The ghetto was closed from 6 p.m. until midday the following day, and Christian guards patrolled the canals to stop people entering and leaving. Initially, Jewish people were also required by law to wear a yellow hat so that people could identify them as Jews. In the early 1600s, however, when The Merchant of Venice is set, most Jews, except those of Levantine origin, wore a red hat. We therefore see that although there was a notable community of Jewish people, they were also segregated from mainstream Venetian life. In addition to this, they were victims of anti-Semitic attitudes and behaviour. Venice is therefore an exciting setting for a story where trade is an intrinsic part of the plot, trade for Christians as well as Jews. The city represents all aspects of money: borrowing, lending, earning, amassing, protecting and fighting for it. It's worth noting that Venice is dominated by men. The only woman, Jessica, is locked away at home and elopes disguised as a man. Belmont, on the other hand, demonstrates the enjoyment of being rich and having no financial worries. It's a place of music and festivity. Through the settings, we therefore see different aspects of wealth. We also see that Belmont is a place of romance in which Bassanio successfully woos Portia, Gratiano woos Nerissa, and the eloping couple Lorenzo and Jessica are welcomed. Interestingly, Belmont is controlled by a woman. However, the shadow of her father influences her life until Bassanio chooses the correct casket. Venice and Jewish people. Setting the play in Venice affords Shakespeare the opportunity to explore ideas about tensions in society. Although Christians did business with Jews, they also felt entitled, as we shall see, to speak and behave in ways that are completely unacceptable by today's standards. There was a considerable amount of anti-Semitism, that's dislike of and prejudice against Jews, at the time the play was written. John Foxe, famous for writing the Book of Martyrs, preached that Jews were heinous abominations, insatiable butcheries, treasons, frenzies and madness. Now it goes without saying this attitude is incredibly offensive. The quotation is just given here to illustrate the strength of contemporary prejudice against Jewish people. So why was anti-Semitism preached by John Foxe? It wasn't always like this, and to understand where these anti-Semitic ideas come from, we need to travel back in time. Firstly, when William the Conqueror invited Jewish people to settle in England after the 1066 conquest, they became an essential part of the English economy. This is because they were allowed to lend money at interest, a practice forbidden in the Bible for Christians. Anti-Semitic ideas were initially linked to the Crusades that began in 1096, when the idea emerged of Jews being Christ killers, and these ideas fueled contemporary prejudice. Then, from the middle of the 12th century, anti-Semitism grew not only in England but also in Europe. Non-Jews maliciously spread false allegations of blood libel, accusing Jews of murdering Christian children so they could use their blood in magic rituals. Under Henry II, the Jews had been protected, but upon his death in 1189, outbreaks of anti-Jewish violence began in London. A year later, the entire Jewish population of York was massacred. Previously, Jewish people had been protected by royalty for business reasons. Jews had given them rich loans or gifts of money since they had set foot on English shores after 1066. Now, ordinary people hardened their attitudes to the Jewish population of England. To make matters worse, the new king, King Henry III, began to force gifts of money from the Jewish community, and because the Jewish community was now in debt, moneylenders sold these loans on. So it's like saying, Chris owes me £10, if you give me the money, Chris can owe it to you instead. The people who bought the loans put pressure on the debtors, the people who owed money, to pay back the loans. If you've ever borrowed money and can't pay it back, you'll understand the stress that this caused. The debtors blamed Jewish moneylenders for their problems. Finally, the next king, Edward I, had enough. In 1275, he banned Jews from money lending. However, by 1290, the king was under financial pressure. He had large debts from overseas wars and he needed cash to settle them. Obviously, he couldn't borrow from Jewish people anymore. The only way he could do this was by asking permission from Parliament to raise a tax, and Parliament granted him the largest single tax of the Middle Ages, £116,000. There were conditions, though. In return for the money, the king issued the 1290 Edict of Expulsion, which banished 3,000 people, the entire population of Jews, from England. Back to Shakespeare's time, the 16th century. A small minority of Jewish people lived in England, but most practiced their faith in secret. Shakespeare might have witnessed anti-Semitic violence. In 1594, remember, The Merchant of Venice was written between 1596 and 1599, Queen Elizabeth's personal physician, a Jewish man called Rodrigo Lopez, was publicly executed, accused of plotting to kill the Queen. If Shakespeare had wanted to speak to Jewish people in London as part of his research, he could also have visited a convert's house in London, which was founded by King Henry III for poor Jewish people who had converted to Christianity. A handful of converts were still living there when The Merchant of Venice was being written. Let's remind ourselves that the original title of the play, when it was registered for copyright in 1598, was The Merchant of Venice, or otherwise called The Jew of Venice, and this begs the question, is the play about Antonio the Merchant or Shylock the Jew? The words otherwise called imply that the contemporary audience might be more interested in Shylock than Antonio. Shakespeare, on the title cover of the first quarto of 1600, marketed the play, focusing on the extreme cruelty of Shylock the Jew towards the merchant in cutting a pound of his flesh. Here he pandered to contemporary views, depicting Shylock solely as a villain. It's interesting to consider that if you're seen to share a belief with someone, they're more likely to listen to you if you attempt to change their mind. The extreme cruelty and the pound of flesh are good crowd pullers, and I'm sure they won't have expected to hear Shylock talk about being a victim of anti-Semitism. This was not the first Elizabethan play to feature a Jew. Christopher Marlowe, a contemporary of Shakespeare, wrote the famous tragedy of the Rich Jew of Malta, which was first performed around 1592. The play is about Barabbas, a cruel, avaricious, wealthy Jew who is a two-dimensional stereotype. Critics generally agree that Shakespeare was influenced by this play when he wrote The Merchant of Venice. There is a direct reference to it in Antonio's trial of Act 4, Scene 1, when Shylock calls Jews the stock of Barabbas. In Marlowe's play, Barabbas has a daughter who elopes with a Christian, and this might have inspired Shylock's Jessica Lorenzo subplot. When Barabbas' daughter elopes, he cries, "Oh, my girl, my gold, my fortune, my felicity," and this compares well with Shylock's "My daughter, oh my ducats, oh my daughter" in Act 2, Scene 8. Like Marlowe, Shakespeare uses the character of a Jew to explore ideas to do with business and to examine the theme of justice and the theme of mercy. In Fiorentino's Il Pecorone, the Jew had no name. He was defined by his religion. What is significant about The Merchant of Venice is that Shylock has a name, a voice, and a family. By setting the play in Venice, Shakespeare is able to draw attention to contemporary prejudice against Jews and challenge these prejudices. It's possible that Shakespeare set the play in Venice in order to challenge contemporary prejudice and encourage his audience to consider their own values through the context of another country. Shylock asks, "If you prick us, do we not bleed?" And through his choice of setting, Shakespeare encourages his audience to understand that Jewish people are no different to them. Belmont and the role of women. We've just looked at one of Shakespeare's reasons for setting the play in Venice and how it might have been to challenge contemporary anti-Semitic attitudes. Shakespeare might also have used the setting of Belmont to challenge contemporary attitudes towards women. While we see Portia conform to feminine stereotypes of the Elizabethan era, we also see her subverting them. Initially, on the title cover of the first quarter of 1600, Shakespeare marketed the play by focusing on Shylock as a cruel villain. He also marketed it on Portia's role as a victim of her father's will, the obtaining of Portia by the choice of the three chests. The word obtaining is interesting, as it implies that Portia is a passive object. We know that Portia's future is dictated by the terms and conditions of her father's will. She has no say in the matter. She's simply the winning prize in a lottery. To understand contemporary attitudes to women, let's explore the role of women in Elizabethan England. Women belonged to their fathers and then their husbands when they married. They could not attend school or university, could not purchase or own property, could not vote, and were not allowed on stage. In plays, the female roles were acted by young men. In Shakespeare's time, arranged marriages were common for upper-class families. A woman was literally the property of her father until she was given to her husband through marriage, and this is the origin of a father walking his daughter down the aisle to give her away at a Christian marriage ceremony. In Elizabethan England, a woman was brought up to obey her father without question. This obedience was then transferred to her husband. It was even written into the wedding vows. When the 1549 Book of Common Prayer was developed during the Reformation, the wedding vows included a promise from the bride to obey her husband-to-be, and it was only in 1928 that the word obey was omitted from the Church of England service. Interestingly, there is still an alternative service today in which the bride can choose to obey her husband. Many members of the contemporary Elizabethan audience shared the idea of an obedient woman, and they would certainly have expected Portia, as a dutiful daughter, to conform to her dead father's wishes. Even after his death, Portia's father, through his will, exerts control over how she will meet her future husband. Far from accepting this without question, we see the first glimpse of Portia's independent spirit when in Act 1, Scene 2, she tells her maid Nerissa, "O me, the word choose! I may neither choose whom I would nor refuse whom I dislike. So is the will of a living daughter curbed by the will of a dead father. Is it not hard, Nerissa, that I cannot choose one nor refuse none?" Shakespeare establishes Portia, then, as a rebel when she mocks her suitors and in the guise of a doctor of letters attends the trial and wins in favour of Antonio. As a feisty wife, she challenges Bassanio about the ring and states that she slept with the doctor of law, thoroughly relishing winding her husband up. In Fiorentino's Il Pecorone, the lady has no name, she's defined by her gender, so Shakespeare gives Portia a name and a voice. In fact, her quality of mercy speech at Antonio's trial is one of the most famous speeches in all of Shakespeare's plays. Through Portia, Shakespeare presents a strong woman who is capable of independent thought and is worth listening to. Despite the strong-willed and independent Queen Elizabeth being on the throne, contemporary attitudes towards women were largely sexist and misogynistic, that's hating or discriminating against women. Shakespeare challenges these views by placing Portia in a foreign setting. As with Shylock, this distances the audience and encourages them to examine their own views. Language. Shakespeare uses three different types of speech for characters: blank verse, prose, and rhymed verse. Blank verse is iambic pentameter that does not rhyme. Iambic pentameter has lines of 10 syllables with alternating unstressed and stressed syllables. In your copy of the play, blank verse looks like poetry on the page. Blank verse is typically used by upper-class characters and the nobility. Sometimes an upper-class character might switch to prose. Prose is ordinary written language. In your copy of the play, prose looks like ordinary written sentences and paragraphs. Shakespeare commonly gives prose to characters of low social status or those engaged in comic scenes. Occasionally, we might see a low-status character speaking in verse. Rhymed verse is unsurprisingly lines of verse which rhyme. Again, it looks like poetry on the page. It might be iambic pentameter, or it might be another rhyme scheme. Shakespeare also uses rhyming couplets, 2 lines that rhyme, often in iambic pentameter, to signal the end of a scene. Everything in this video can be found in the 2nd edition of Mr. Bruff's Guide to the Merchant of Venice, which I co-wrote with Kerry Lewis, so pick up a copy through following the links in the description. It contains the complete original text, a line-by-line translation into modern English, and detailed analysis, so there will always be more in the book than you'll find in the video series, so do pick up a copy. On the first page of the first quarto, 1600, Shakespeare describes the Merchant of Venice as a comical history of the Merchant of Venice. The intention is therefore to establish it as a comedy, but comedy doesn't mean that it is an Adam Sandler movie in the making. What are the elements of a play when we call it a comedy? Well, key ideas are: Number 1, there are lovers who are kept apart due to problems, usually associated with parents. For example, Portia has the obstacle of her father's will to overcome before she can marry, and Jessica has the obstacle of her father, Shylock. Number 2, the lovers marry before the end of the play. Number 3, no one dies at the end. Number 4, there's an element of separation and being reunited. So we see Portia and Nerissa, who appear to go to a nunnery while Bassanio and Gratiano go to Venice to support Antonio, and the lovers are reunited at the end. Jessica is locked in her home by Shylock, physically separated from Lorenzo before they elope. Upon his arrest and trial, Antonio is separated from his friends, and they reunite after the successful outcome of the trial. The central conflict or problem of Antonio's trial is resolved, so no physical harm has been done to him. Cross-dressing and mistaken identities, all the women in the play cross-dress as men. A clever, witty servant, Launcelot Gobbo. Puns and comedy. Much of the humour is created by Launcelot Gobbo. There is also comedy at the end of the play, with the rings in the final act. However, Shakespeare's play is unusual. The lovers marry halfway through the play before the main conflict of Antonio's trial has been resolved, and this is unusual because lovers usually marry at the end of a play. Why is this? Perhaps Shakespeare is implying that the 3 sets of lovers are not as lovers in other Shakespearean comedies. After their marriages, the focus shifts to Venice and Antonio's trial, and it seems that Shakespeare wants this to be more important. Nerissa, unlike Portia and Jessica, doesn't have any obstacles to overcome before she marries Gratiano. In comedies, family tensions are resolved at the end. In a sense, the tension created by Portia's father's will is resolved, but the relationship between Shylock and Nerissa is not. Audience members, particularly contemporary ones, might also be uncomfortable with the play being classified as a comedy due to Shakespeare's treatment of Shylock. The latter's determination to have his pound of flesh marks him as a villain. However, as a victim of anti-Semitism, the audience is likely to feel sympathy towards him, especially during his famous "If you prick us, do we not bleed" speech in Act 3, which challenges contemporary attitudes. He's therefore a complex character, and our empathy is heightened when we see his grief following Jessica's elopement. The ending of the play, in which Shylock is forced to convert to Christianity, alone and destitute, does not sit comfortably with many people. Perhaps this is the whole point. Perhaps it's Shakespeare's way of encouraging contemporary audience members to re-evaluate anti-Semitic values